All right, so welcome everyone, and thanks so much for joining us here today. My name is Jazz Keeler, and I am the Contract Virtual Programs Coordinator with Griffin Art Projects. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Griffin Art Projects is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Stolo nations, and we are very honored and grateful to undertake our work here. So thank you very much for joining us for a live director's talk and Q&A with filmmaker Karen Cho. And today's program is scheduled in conjunction with Griffin Art Project's current exhibition, Who's Chinatown? Examining Chinatown Gazes in Art, Archives, and Collections, guest curated by Karen Tam, and is on view at Griffin Art Projects until May 1st. And we would like to thank the Richmond Art Gallery in assisting Griffin Art Projects greatly with the Who's Chinatown exhibition, as well as the North Vancouver Rec and Culture and Canada Council for the Arts for their generous support of this project. So before we jump in, I just have a few brief housekeeping notes. I'd like to mention that we are in webinar format today, which means that though you can see us, we cannot see or hear you in the audience today, but do feel free to get in touch with us and each other using the chat option, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And there will also be a Q&A session at the end of today's talk. So feel free at any point throughout the talk to type your questions into the Q&A dialog box. And you'll notice that the Q&A dialog box is actually separate from the chat. So it's just at the bottom of your screen and to the left. And once we get to the Q&A, you'll also have the option to ask your question out loud. So if that's your preference, and we do always love to hear your voice, just feel free to indicate in the Q&A dialog box that you'd like to be unmuted. And we will do that when the Q&A session arrives. So Griffin is really thrilled to be hosting Karen today. Thank you so much, Karen, for joining us. And we do hope that you were able to watch Karen's powerful documentary, In the Shadow of Gold Mountain. If you haven't had a chance to do so yet, I definitely recommend it. It's such a very poignant and powerful film, and it's available for viewing online through the National Film Board of Canada's website. We've included a link in our Zoom confirmation email, so you should be able to find it there, and if not, I'll drop it in the chat in just a moment after the introductions. But I did want to start today's program by sharing a clip from the documentary, and actually there's a really amazing online education webpage that Karen sent me. So if there's any teachers in the audience or anyone that just would like to dig a little bit deeper, it's a really great resource. And so the clip that I'm going to play just now is taken from that mini education webpage. So just bear with me for a moment while I prepare to share my screen here.
Is all that Canada has to say to them.
In the early day, the Chinese came to the state. They go to California. There's a gold rush. That time China was so poor, no industry, only farmers. That's why they call this place, North America, Gold Mountain, because if you come here, you return rich. Well, after the gold rush, Chinese came to Canada. They were railroad builder. The government have no objection.
John A. Macdonald said that in Parliament, that we have to accept Chinese labor or we're not going to be able to finish this railroad.
Honorable friends, the Chinese immigrant has no common interest with us. And while he gives us his labor, he's paid for it. And he is valuable the same as a threshing machine or any other agricultural implement. It will be all very well to exclude Chinese labor when we can replace it with white labor. But until that is done, it is better to have Chinese labor than no labor at all.
Many lives were lost. Many Chinese labor lost their lives in the course of building because they have to blast, using dynamite to blast through the Rockies to open up the channels. And when that railway was eventually completed, that paved the way for Confederation. For had it not been for the Chinese laborers, I don't know when whether BC would have become a part of Canada.
After the railway was completed, then they don't want the Chinese laborers. They want them to go home, and they don't want any more Chinese immigration coming to Canada.
There is probability of a grave injury being caused to the working classes by the large influx of laborers
Not
from
only are they
China.
monopolizing the laundry business and the growing of vegetables in British Columbia, but they are driving skilled miners out of employment.
The white society, they got alarmed. They said, hey, wow, they breed like flies and more coming. Wow, pretty soon this is no longer going to be white man's country. At first, they put up a head tax. They thought that would be a deterrent, $50. And yet they still come. They come, and they were still pouring in. So they jack it up to $100. And that couldn't stop them. They still keep coming and coming and coming. Finally, they raised it to $500, and even $500 couldn't stop them.
They paid the $500 willingly. They came within the context of the Canadian Immigration Act. The irony is that the Immigration Act, or the $500 head tax, was imposed to keep them out.
To me, I think it was a terrible insult. The kids that put their heart into helping build the railroad, which was the lifeline of Canada. As F.R. Scott wrote, he wrote this in response to a poem written by Ned Pratt. Where are all the coolies in your poem, Ned? Where are the thousands of Chinese that swung their pickaxes with bare hands at 40 below? From that first to the millionth spike they drove, to that dressed-up act of Donald Smith, who has sung their story? Did they fare well in the country that they helped unite? Did they get one of the 25 million CPR shares? Is all that Canada has to say to them is what's written in the Chinese Immigration Act?
Okay, so that is just a short 4-minute clip. You can, as I mentioned, watch the full 43-minute documentary if you hadn't already through the National Film Board of Canada's website, and I'll post the link in the chat in just a minute. But Griffin is so honored and thrilled to be hosting Karen Cho today. And it's an honor to introduce Karen. So Karen Cho is a filmmaker of mixed heritage known for her socially engaged documentaries, TV and web series. Karen's work has touched on subjects like the Chinese head tax, refugees, women's rights, Aboriginal health, Japanese-Canadian internment, Vancouver's downtown east side, and artist activists around the world. In 2018, Karen was nominated for a Best Directing Canadian Screen Award for her work on CBC's Interrupt This program. Karen is currently working on a film about disappearing Chinatowns with celebrated documentary production company I Steal Film. So thanks again, Karen, for your time and for joining us here today. And I'll pass it over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Zoom this afternoon. I'm really honored to be part of this exhibit with the Griffin Arts Project. And I'm so thankful, that In the Shadow of Gold Mountain is, still being used today and still a relevant film in the present. I guess usually, I mean, it's odd. I'm usually live with folks. We're watching the film together and then we can talk about it together. But I guess usually I start by giving a kind of background on why I made the film. I mean, that at this point, the film is an older film. It was the very first documentary film I made. I shot it in 2003 and it came out in 2004. But the impetus for the film was actually this book here. And it's just a book I happened to get out of the library. I mean, there's lots of books on Chinese Canadian history, but this one was called In a Strange Land. And it had a lot of photos of the Chinese way back, it's just out of curiosity. But what really hit me about this book was the last page, essentially, here, I'll just turn to it here. There, like it shows this cartoon of kind of Oriental exclusion. But the last page basically says, because the book was from the Chinese in Canada from 1788 until 1923. And the last page essentially said, on July 1st, 1923, Canada passed a law where there were no more Chinese allowed in Canada. And I remember being shocked. Like I'd never heard of this before. I'd never learned about it in my history classes. I remember being completely shocked and wanting there to be another page to the book and thinking, how can that be the end of the story? It's got to be, for me, that was like the beginning of the story. So in a way, that's what kind of drove me to make this film. At the time, the NFB had a program called Real Diversity, which was for emerging filmmakers of color. It was a kind of a competition, and I had an idea to do this film, and I thought it would go well with this program that the NFB had put out. So long story short, I managed to get the funding to make the film, and the result was In the Shadow of Gold Mountain. But for me, as a filmmaker, it really kind of set the tone. Like I wasn't necessarily even thinking of going into documentary filmmaking back then. And it really shaped my vision as a filmmaker, as a storyteller, and made me realize the power of documentary and storytelling, that's real. After the film was finished, the Chinese Canadian community, they were still fighting for redress. And they kind of took the film and ran with it, which was great. It kind of coalesced with the last 2 years of a very, very long fight for redress. And the film opened in Chinatowns across Canada, and lots of redress activists used the film as a tool, which is what I had hoped it would be to educate folks about this history and to really kind of spark a discussion. And I'm just so thankful that, something that started with me, wondering why didn't I learn this in any history books, ended up being this film, which I'm very thankful to say it has made it into some curriculum, not necessarily in my province of Quebec, but in other provinces. It has made it into curriculum in different schools and is still used today in various ways through libraries or community groups. So anyways, I'm very thankful for that. I thought I would share my screen with you. I've just because people probably, and I hope it's working. Maybe, okay, it seems to be working. Because people might want a little bit of, I guess, an update since the film was done. So most folks on this call probably do know that in 2006, the Canadian government did apologize for the head tax. By that point, there were very few head taxpayers left living and very few widows left alive. But overall, 785 people approximately, received a kind of symbolic payment. There was an official apology, but descendants and families of head taxpayers were not compensated. So in the film, one of the people or the subjects that really resonates with so many people is Gim Wong. And he himself and his generation were excluded actually from the compensation for the apology. I thought I'd give you a little bit of an update on some of the things since the film. So obviously in 2005, Gim did do his ride for redress, if anyone doesn't know, and he talked about it to me in the film. The photos on the side of him on his motorbike, and then he's with the film crew for In the Shadow of Gold Mountain, and then there's a newspaper article of him actually doing the ride for redress. Gim and his son Jeffrey, they rode from Hope, BC to Montreal in 2005. And he did exactly what he said he would, on July 1st, rode into Ottawa, raised a ruckus there, and really kind of, this moment, this ride for redress was really a kind of turning of the tides in the redress movement. Gim did pass away in 2013, but he was there at the ceremony when they apologized. And, I think the impact of it goes without saying, like the impact that Gim's generation did for Chinese Canadians in general, getting us the right to vote, but also Gim himself in the redress movement, was hugely impactful. James Wing, also the head taxpayer from Montreal, he was also alive at the time of the apology. I remember even at the time I filmed with Mr. Wing, he was, I think, 92 around at the time. And even then his short-term memory was going a bit, because every time I would come and visit him again, he'd always be like, who are you? And why are you asking me all these questions? And I'd have to re-explain to him that I was trying to do a film on the head tax. But as you could tell from the film and the clip that we saw, that his long-term memory was really strong, and he, throughout the 80s had fought so long for the redress, that it was actually something that marked me a lot. I remember after they had announced that the redress would happen, I bumped into Mr. Wing, I think it was in Chinatown at an event. And I was so excited to talk to him. I said, Mr. Wing, aren't you so happy to know that, the government's going to apologize? There's going to be redress. And I remember him turning to me and he says, Karen, because he had such, he had no short-term memory, essentially. So he turned to me and says, Karen, they're never going to apologize, the government. We tried that already. I give up. And so it was really kind of heartbreaking at the end that, he was alive to get the redress check, and he was such a huge part of fighting for that redress, but he was also so old by the time that it didn't even necessarily stick with him that the redress had happened. Likewise, Charlie Kwan actually lived to be about 105. He too was alive for the redress. I know there's a photo of him. It's from Todd Wong's website. Anyone from Vancouver, I'm sure, knows a lot of the folks in this photo. That's Charlie with his check. And I know at the time he had talked about using the money to take a trip back to China, to his original village with his family. And I'm not sure if he's managed to do that, or he did manage to do that. And then likewise, Chow Quyen Lee, the widow in the film, she lived to be 106 and only passed away, a short time ago. Yu Lee, her son, and we've still remained in contact, and as have I with a lot of the folks that I know from making the film. There's so many really rich relationships remain from doing the film. And in a way, I've kind of come full circle, because I'm doing a documentary right now about endangered Chinatowns in North America. And so many of the folks that I knew from the film of, In the Shadow of Gold Mountain have, are the kind of same connections that I have today as well. And it's funny to kind of be doing this film on the Chinatowns right now, because about a year, or literally a year ago this March, I was in New York City at a conference of Chinatowns, like 2 days before the pandemic hit. And I'd never seen New York's Chinatown so empty. This was before, everything, but there was just such a stigma on the neighborhood. And we've all lived through this past year where a lot of the kind of, Roy Ma talks about it in the film, and so does Gim, a lot of the racism and the fact that Chinatown itself was really kind of, I guess, like a original sanctuary city for Chinese. It was a safe place for folks, and I don't come from that era, but it was very real to some of the folks in the film. The idea of crossing the Chinatown boundary, you would get beaten in the streets, and you wouldn't, be allowed to be in certain professions and whatnot. And seeing the kind of rise in the anti-Asian sentiment that's happened today, I have seen a lot of parallels from the reasons why Chinatowns in a way were originally set up, and this kind of year that we're coming out of, and still this pandemic that we're still living through, the kind of anti-Asian sentiment that's bubbled up once again in a public way. But I'll stop my share for the moment, because there are very parallels today, but I just want to give folks time if they have questions, or, I'd love to hear your voices, or if not, Jazz had mentioned you can write in the chat if any folks had questions or wanted to know a little bit more.
Yeah, Yeah, thanks so much, Karen. I'll jump on just for a minute, just to note that if anyone would like to unmute their mics, just go ahead and type in the Q&A that you'd like to ask it out loud. But otherwise, yes, I'm more than happy to read your questions for Karen. But yeah, Karen, thank you so much again for sharing that slideshow and for providing that background and the follow-up that you've had a chance to make with the subjects of your documentary. And it is so true that it's such a powerful film, and this year more than ever I feel it's so important to be revisiting it. And yeah, oh, I see we do have a question. Okay, we have a question from Elizabeth Cho. So Elizabeth, I have unmuted you, so please do go ahead, and you should be able to ask your question out loud.
Hi, Mom. I don't know. I don't think she's able to unmute.
Okay, am I unmute now?
Yeah.
No? Yes?
You're unmuted, yeah.
Okay. Okay, so we watched your documentary again, and it was really good, and it is quite it's a long time ago, but it is quite up to date. So we were amazed at that, and all that they had said. It's like it's so long ago, but they're still fighting for those things. Like, anyway, that's what I just want to comment.
Yeah, well, thanks. that is actually my mother. It's funny. So thanks, Mom. Yeah, I mean, maybe I should share the rest of this, because it's true that like I have noticed so many connections between this kind of history that the film brings up and this moment that we're in right now. And like these photos you'll see, you know, some of them are from the Japanese internment during World War II or the 1907 riots in Vancouver's Chinatown. But we've lived through this moment, or are living through this moment, where because of COVID-19, a lot of this you know, specters of this kind of ugliness are happening and are very real realities for lots of not just Chinese, but Asian Canadians and Asian, you know, Asians everywhere. You know, the Chinese in Chinatown were always seen as kind of dirty or diseased in the past. It was part of the kind of rhetoric around these folks. But even like when I started the film in 2003, and I've got like this is like a political cartoon from that era, the community was just coming out of SARS at that moment. And I remember like at the beginning of doing in the Shadow of Gold Mountain, some head tax activists from Montreal had invited me because they were going to speak on a panel at the national, at the Congress. It was the National Congress of Chinese Canadians, because back in the day, there was a kind of split in the Chinese Canadian community. There was folks, you know, the CCNC was very involved in leading the kind of fight for redress. And there was another group, the National Congress, who were kind of against, in a way, individual compensation. And there were some activists trying to bridge this, you know, divide between the community. And I remember being at this event, and it's something that really struck me and kind of, in a way, it gave me the angle for the film, for lack of a better word. This is before I began the entire film. They were having a debate about whether or not they should join the fight to ask for compensation for the head tax. And there was a kind of debate going on, and an older gentleman stood up, and he was actually quite well known. I won't say his name, but he was very well known. You know, he was, I believe it was a city politician at the time. And he stood up and he said, you know, how dare we stand here and try to ask for compensation for this head tax? You know, had it not been for my grandfather, you know, I'd be rotting in some rice paddy field somewhere. So how dare we complain, you know, in 2003, how dare we ask for this kind of compensation? And I remember it didn't quite register with me at the time, but I remember thinking after, because I'm mixed race, thinking back to, well, half my family, you know, was given free farmland to come here, to settle here. And were it not for, you know, my Scottish or Irish or British great grandfather, I could be rotting in some potato field somewhere, but no one in those communities would ever think that they're not entitled to ask for this kind of apology. So I really kind of saw firsthand, and it's still palpable today, the kind of internalized racism within the community itself, like this idea of never thinking we're Canadian enough or we're worthy enough to ask for what's essentially the rights of every Canadian. And today with COVID, the film talked about obviously the Chinese railway workers, but today, you can draw like a straight line to temporary foreign workers, live-in caregivers, and a lot of folks who are working in, meat packing plants, keeping the food supply chain going, and their own lives are being put in, dangerous situations, and they're not necessarily in a position to be able to speak freely about it because they could lose their employment. So anyways, those are, kind of having done the film so many years ago, but being in this moment where so many things are happening, the history is really important, or knowing your history is very important in informing the way you see the present, and hopefully the future as well. So that's one big takeaway I did get from the film.
Great, thanks so much, Karen. I'm going to unmute myself here because we do have a few questions for you in the Q&A. So I'll read the first question from a participant who writes, what do you hope will come from the making of Endangered Chinatowns? And then they write, thank you for your previous film, by the way, amazing work.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, no, the film on the Endangered Chinatowns, in a way, it started. I'm in the process of filming this film right now, and the film has changed quite a bit because it started as, it was going to talk about gentrification pressures in Chinatown, and I was noticing these patterns in so many of the Chinatowns. And then, of course, COVID hit, and in a way, kind of took over some of the story. But I'm also not interested in necessarily, because there's this constant narrative around Chinatowns where they're always about to die. There's, they're always on, like about to be erased and whatnot. And it's not necessarily true in the sense that I've seen so many folks who are really engaged in working in their Chinatowns, revitalizing the Chinatowns, bringing back this kind of appreciation for the, the cultural production of the neighborhood and these intangible kind of cultural assets that happen in Chinatowns. So with the film, what I'm trying to do is focus also on the agency of the communities. There's so many inspiring stories coming out of various Chinatowns. At the moment, I've been filming in New York, Toronto, and Montreal's Chinatown. I hope to come out to Vancouver's Chinatown also once things open up. And I hope to be filming this film, or this new film, until Lunar New Year of next year. And the reason for that is I also want to be able to see Chinatown come out of the kind of COVID pandemic. So much of Chinatown is beyond this kind of tourist facade that a lot of us only know about, like going to some gift shops or restaurants. But, I want to go beyond the kind of storefront and above the street level. There's family associations. There's so much of where the community, the living community lives. So, and to kind of see these kind of stories that I've been uncovering, these inspirational stories of folks really imagining Chinatown in a new way. Chinatown's a very historic neighborhood, but it's also holds a key to the future in a way, or it's an artifact of the future, as Andy Yan, who's this kind of very famous urban planner in Vancouver, says. And this idea of Chinatown as a look on the future, I think it's Chinatown is an amazing neighborhood. It's kind of that Jane Jacobs style of like street level city planning, where folks, there's like a real community feeling there. It's from the ground up where it's about, being able to age in place for the seniors that live there, to have the kind of culturally appropriate and affordable food and housing and all of this. And in most Chinatowns, they're in urban, or the historic Chinatowns are in urban centers, so they're accessible by public transport and whatnot. And in a way, if we think about the future of Chinatown as an inclusive future, and understanding the history of Chinatown as an original sanctuary city. What we do in Chinatowns, in every city, can be a model for urban planning of the future. So in a way, the film is kind of exploring all of those things, and it's been a bit challenging because, you know, I'm actually filming remotely. I have a shooter down in New York, and I'm kind of like on the phone while some of this stuff is being shot. But I do hope to, you know, be able to celebrate the kind of amazing communities that exist in Chinatowns all over. Well, yeah, at the time of doing the film, I actually did a lot of research, and thank God a lot of it has actually been digitized now. So if you go to, I think it's Library and Archives Canada, they have digitized a lot of the ship manifestos. So these are, you know, if your ancestor arrived on the Empress of India or the Empress of Japan or whatever, they would have been marked down. There's a kind of log of everyone, and it says if they were a head taxpayer or not. And I know I think it's called the Lowell Directory, but there is a kind of, a lot of this stuff has been digitized, and people who are into genealogy use a lot of these city directory kind of things from back in the day, and they look up their ancestors' name, and you can find a lot through that. I managed to connect with, it's same thing, because my great grandfather is also buried in a Chinese section of a cemetery here in Pointe-aux-Trembles in Montreal, and on the tombstone in Chinese also, you know, it says the name of the family village, and it was because of that I was able to find the Wu side of my family, that it's my maternal, or my father's mother, her side of the family. I was able to go back to the village in China because they had the name written on the tombstone, and I was able to connect with family that way. But yeah, a lot of these archives have been digitized now, and there's a lot of kind of message boards about trying to chase for Toisan folks or people looking for their genealogy. Like, I'd encourage you to go, like, online. There's a lot of resources and a lot of groups kind of, you know, helping out folks trying to find their histories through all of that. Well, at the moment, I would start with the Library and Archives Canada, the ship manifestos, and I think it might be that if you do a general Google search, but, you know, the head taxpayer list or the ship manifest, Chinese Canadian immigrants, Library and Archives Canada, you should be able to get to these kind of ship manifestos that were digitized. Yeah, well, I mean, the Chinatown film I'm doing now does tie into various kind of social justice issues. I've done also a film, not specifically on the Chinese, but it is a film called Seeking Refuge, which was about refugees navigating Canada's immigration system. And I've also done another documentary, which you can watch on the same National Film Board website, called Status Quo, and it was a film on the women's rights movement in Canada, and kind of what, you know, looking in the history and the present, like what still needs to be done.
Amazing. Yes, thanks so much, Karen. And Karen Tam also just posted a helpful link in the chat, which is the Chinese genealogy guide and resources provided by the Vancouver Public Library. So thank you so much, Karen, for that link as well. So I have a question here from an attendee who is wondering, did opinions vary depending on where people lived? For example, a large Asian population in Vancouver or a smaller population elsewhere?
Do they mean opinions with regard to the head tax redress? Is that what the questioner wants to know about?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily geographic region, but as we all know, you know, the Chinese are Asians, and like, we're not a monolith, right? So not everyone should be expected to have the same opinion.
Yes.
I think it really divided along the lines of folks who were, you know, like firsthand, like they had firsthand experience, like they were descendants of head taxpayers, or they were head taxpayers, and their family felt the brunt of, you know, the Exclusion Act, and like firsthand, you know, versus, you know, there's obviously different waves of immigration. in Canada, where people are newer, or they come from different areas, Hong Kong, mainland China, Taiwan. There was also a kind of larger divide in the community, and it does. We have it in the film because Roy Ma, who was very well known, he was the same kind of generation that Gim was, and they were the World War II veterans. So back in the day, the Chinese Canadians who weren't, they actually didn't even have citizenship at the time. And these were folks like Gim and like Roy, who were born in Canada. When World War II hit, they volunteered to fight in the army, to fight for Canada in the Second World War. And the trade-off was, or their thinking, and they managed to obviously succeed, was that they'd have the right to demand the franchise or to demand their citizenship rights. And it is because of that generation that I have a Canadian passport, and and anyone after 1947 was able to vote and then subsequently actually bring their families here. So for that generation, I think they were opposed in a way to the head tax redress, because they had felt that we fought, our generation fought to win the franchise, to get our citizenship, and we have to let certain bygones be bygones, right? So which is absolutely fine. Not everyone in the community should be expected to agree on everything. But then that shouldn't necessarily block, the head taxpayers that were remaining and still alive and wanting to fight and all of that. But it's also one of these things that happens in communities of color. And I do want to point it out that, like, the government or whoever you're fighting for, it always uses this as an excuse, this kind of divide and conquer thing. It's like, well, until you guys can get it together and all agree, we're not going to pay compensation, or, it's a classic move of politicians they always use a divided community as an excuse not to have action on anything. And if we were a bunch of white folks, I don't think anyone would would want all the white people to agree on one issue. We simply don't. So likewise with communities of color, if you're fighting for certain issues, you shouldn't be expected to all have the same opinion, because you don't all have the same lived experience, but it was something that really kind of delayed or delayed politicians in taking action on the redress. That's for sure, this kind of divide that existed in the community.
Thanks so much, Karen. So we have a question from an audience member, May Wong. So May, you should be able to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hey, Karen.
Hi, May.
Good to see you on Zoom. Thank you so much for your film. I was a neighbor and friend of the Wings in Montreal, and so it was really nice today again to see Simon and his dad and his daughter on film. So thank you again for that. My father, Gaydang Wong, was also a $500 head taxpayer, and unfortunately he died before you were able to talk to him. And my mother was also passed away before the redress was available. But my question to you, I live in Victoria now. My question to you is whether or not you'll be coming to Victoria to film, because it is Canada's oldest Chinatown. And it's really changing now. The face of it is becoming more and more non-Chinese, because there's condos going up on the one street that we have as Chinatown. And there are a lot of businesses that are moving in, which, I think in many places that's happening, but it would be interesting to see the kind of changes that are happening here.
Oh, thanks, May. Thanks for your question. I've been in the past. I've been to Victoria's Chinatown. I've actually filmed a short thing for a different series there. I don't necessarily have plans. It's also up in the air, because part of my film was also planning to shoot in San Francisco, Victoria being the oldest Canadian Chinatown and San Francisco being the oldest one in North America. But what you're describing in Victoria, is something that's happened in many places, and also a lot of, and I think Victoria would qualify as this, in a way, Chinatowns are becoming kind of like ethno Disney worlds of themselves, like where a lot of the past, these kind of revitalization efforts, it's a lot about keeping facades and keeping the arches and making it look like a Chinatown, where the kind of community and the culture that existed or exists in these buildings kind of fades away, and it's something that's we have to be very cognizant of. And I think urban planners and other folks are thinking a lot more, they're taking a lot more nuanced look at how you revitalize communities, right? Because it's not, in a way, I can care less about the Chinatown arches, because in Montreal, anyone who knows Montreal's history, the arches actually signify like the enclosure of our Chinatown, which used to be probably 5 times larger. And as a trade-off for Guy Favreau and all these other buildings that they kind of dropped onto the Chinatown, they put up these gates, which to an outsider looks like, oh, this is a great way of delineating Chinatown. But to folks who had lived there, and my grandmother was born in Chinatown, these gates actually signify the enclosure of Chinatown. Like, Chinatown cannot get any bigger than where we put up these gates. And now in my Chinatown, they're in the process of building 2 giant condo projects on the side of one of the big gates, and the entire face of the thing is moving. So it's complicated, because you also can't mothball a Chinatown and just relegate it to the history books. Like people live there still, businesses, they're working people, working businesses, but there has to be a kind of balance of, how do you revitalize these places, respect the history, but also allow the culture, the cultural production to grow at the same time, and folks to still afford to live there while it's happening. So there's but I mean, I would love to kind of come out to Victoria again. So who knows, I'm kind of waiting at the moment for things to open up again and to be able to film Chinatowns as they are meant to be, in a way, as these kind of community gathering spaces.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Karen. So we'll now hear from another audience member named Jean. So Jean, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Hey, thanks very much. So this is Jean from Calgary, and I have to congratulate you on your film. I didn't know about your film, even though you made it in 2000. It was filmed and released in 2004. I wasn't aware of it until this occasion. And you were very lucky to actually have acquired and to be able to film the remaining head taxpayers and their family members at that time. That's very historic. So I think there are segments in your film that are actually real modern history, Chinese Canadian history. And the little clips of CCNC brought back memories. I was on the national board for CCNC. I'm not sure if there are any members here listening in who also came from CCNC when Gary Yee was the national president driving the redress. So it was through his incredible leadership. And you have to have been there to have witnessed the level of activism. My great uncle was a head taxpayer. He also sponsored my father to come to Canada. My father came to Canada 4 years after the Chinese Canadians won the vote. Several questions or several suggestions. I would recommend to somehow try to interview somebody from Calgary's Chinatown. The whole of the downtown area was flooded in June 2013. It was a very serious flood. It made national, international news. Then 100,000 people were evacuated. Some of the Chinatown businesses had to restart all over again, or they completely collapsed. So it might be useful as a very different type of side story. Also, because Calgary is where the CPR has its national office. So it's sort of like the nexus in terms of how the CP rail was influential in different parts of Canada. And certainly that probably drew part of the Chinese after the gold rush there. Another question is, in Toronto, since I lived and worked in Toronto for almost 20 years, then I moved to Vancouver, and now I'm in Calgary. So I know all 3 Chinatowns in Toronto, as well as Vancouver, and now you notice in Calgary, you have the historic Chinatown, which in Toronto is Spadina and Dundas, and also by Broadview. But you also have other mini Chinatowns in Richmond Hill, in Asian Court, in Vancouver, is in the Marpole area, it's in Richmond, the city of Richmond near the airport, in addition to the old Chinatown. Do you have plans to interview people actually in the newer Chinatown areas? Because they will probably give you a very interesting spin. I have to say, as somebody who was involved in cycling, advocacy and all that, sort of Chinatown, when you talk about gentrification, what comes with that is creation of bike lanes and all that kind of stuff. And sometimes the reaction of businesses, they're still like any other business, they're hesitant, they think it's going to take away their business. So there's a lot of forces and pressures for the more gentrified areas of that type of stuff happening. And it's also helping those people who run businesses, how they can market themselves in a much more modern way, so it speaks to a younger audience. Also, how other more recent Chinese Canadians view the older Chinatowns, because they never lived, their families never lived through from the late 1800s into the 1950s. They came after that. So I think there's different layers when we talk about the gentrification and preservation of old Chinatown, what kind of support one could get from the other areas as well for that. So I think it's a tough one. And it will probably add some interesting flavors for your documentary. So
thanks, Jean, for bringing that up. It is actually something that I'm actively looking for at the moment. And I mean, I should mention, if there's anyone on this call also who would like to connect with me about their connection to their Chinatowns, because I mean, I hope to kind of do like an exploration of, there are these newer, quote unquote, I'm going to call them suburban Chinatowns, and the connections you have to the kind of historic downtown ones versus these newer Chinatowns are different. And one of the core questions of the film is also like, why do we need Chinatown today? And there are some folks who do believe, in a way, because of Chinatown, like the beginnings of Chinatown, Chinatown was a ghetto. And for people like my grandmother's generation, who was born in the Chinatown and got out of the Chinatown, like being able to live outside of Chinatown was a big deal. It almost, signaled your kind of integration into quote unquote Canadian society. And this idea that we don't need to, but like we're safe outside the Chinatown gates now. We're kind of successful and all of these kind of things. And often now, I mean, you look at Scarborough, Richmond, like Chinatown isn't necessarily the gateway for new immigrants, the way it was in the past, like the old historic Chinatowns I'm talking about. New York's Chinatown is very much still is. But some other folks, they go directly to Scarborough, and you can argue that Scarborough is the modern day Chinatown. So I'm definitely looking to kind of, explore those nuances and how people have different, relationships to their Chinatowns. And what you said, with regards to, working with the CCNC and folks like Gary Yee and all of that, and just to bring it back also to the head tax thing, that like learning about the head tax, or meeting some of the head tax activists and learning about the whole movement for the redress and this history, for me, coming from this place where all I knew about my Chinese Canadianness, was in that Heritage Minute that everyone remembers, like where they send the boy into the mountain with some dynamite. That is all the learning that I had about my Chinese Canadian background. And when I finally uncovered all of these stories, I mean, I'm not like I'm the first to know it, but when I finally uncovered for myself, I did this kind of history chasing and knew all these things. Like the kind of, first of all, I realized that being mixed race, like the side of myself that's Chinese was actually the side that's most Canadian. Like literally the most recent immigrant in my family is my grandfather, who came from England after the Second World War. He's like the most recent immigrant, this white guy from Britain. My Chinese ancestors have been here a lot longer. But it's also realizing that like, and celebrating, like, we have heroes too. Like I remember sitting, if there's anyone on the call, I see Elwin, I think, was on the call, but from BC, you know, sitting in Newtown Bakery with Sid Tan, and so much of his footage was incorporated into this film because he was really the record keeper of that whole, I mean, continues to be, but through the community television, he filmed all of that stuff that went down. And sitting with him in this cafe, and I remember him explaining to me, Karen, you know, the low walk queue that they're called, like the old overseas Chinese, the head taxpayers that first came over, he says they sent in from the villages, they sent the best and the brightest, you know, and we are descendants of the folks that, you know, kept these villages, you know, during the Japanese invasion, during these famines. You know, we're the descendants of these folks that lived through 62 years of legislated racism and kept their families together in China. You know, like, you have to understand the kind of heroes that we come from. And I think it was kind of a light bulb moment for me, where you also have to realize, when we talk about the narrative of nation building in Canada, and I know we're also in a colonial time, a time of looking at colonialism and the impact, and we are also settlers. Like, I'm fully aware of that, but the idea that as Chinese, we can say, like, we helped also to build this country, and to be proud of that. And to, you know, like, I remember sitting at a dinner with Gary Yee and being like, I can't believe I'm beside Gary Yee. This is amazing. Like, what did this guy do for like to you know, sensitize Chinese Canadians to their own ability to speak up? Like it's like you're walking amongst your living day heroes. You know, it was amazing to me. So anyways, I was just so thankful to be able to meet all these folks in the process of making this film. And to really realize my history here and my understanding of who I am, you know, through this window, and kind of, you know, it changes your outlook on, you know, who is a Canadian, what is a Canadian, you know?
Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Karen. And we have Gary Yee in the audience today, who is going to join the conversation. So Gary, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. First off, Karen, it's a pleasure to meet you. And I want to thank you very much for producing that film that I have watched in the past. And again, I have had the opportunity to watch it again. It's, I could see it was made from your heart. And it's truly a film that I can relate to, as my father was a head taxpayer. Very well done. Thank you very much. It's inspirational, that is for sure. What I'd like to mention to you is that there is a curator in Vancouver by the name of Catherine Clement. I don't know if you're familiar with her work. She has produced a number of different exhibits, and the probably one you may be aware of is the Yu Cho Chow exhibit, and she has produced a book recently, that's very well received. Now her new initiative is something called Remembering 1923, the Chinese Exclusion Act. It's something that she's working toward putting together for 2023, which of course will be the 100th anniversary on July the 1st. And the stage she's at now, and I am assisting her on this regard, is to try to contact families that may or may have the original immigration documents of their ancestors. And with these documents, they're called CI certificates, she's planning to put together an exhibit, okay? And she's very adept at this, she's very creative. And all these documents that will be used will eventually be digitally archived and stored in a very secure but accessible repository. It's at a site yet to be determined. There's still lots of discussions to be done as yet. So I just want to bring that initiative to your attention. And I do have a PDF document from her if you're interested, or I could send it direct to Griffith's Art Projects.
Yeah, no, that would be great. I mean, I know Catherine's project, I think, is probably also linked with the seat at the table kind of exist
Yes.
and all the stuff happening with Henry. But yeah, these are this is the kind of, it's so important, like, to tell our stories. And I digging in the archives, we don't have the paper ones, but I've managed to find all the CI9 certificates of my family that happened to be digitized. So these were the certificates. They weren't head tax certificates, but if your family wanted to travel back to China,
Yes,
they
indeed.
needed a special certificate to prove that they were allowed back in the country. And I discovered that my great grandfather, as soon as his youngest child, my uncle Harry, was born in Montreal, Chinatown, he registered all his 3 children, my grandmother and her 2 brothers that were born here as well, because the family had to go back. There was a sickness in the family for a little bit. But yeah, no, I think it would be great if the Griffin Arts Project can share these, because I'm sure a lot of the folks on the call, their families likely have these kind of pieces of paper in their archives.
Yes, that would be absolutely terrific. And it's not that difficult to contact Catherine. She is based in Vancouver, Chinatown. I believe that's where she has her office, and I'm assisting her because I'm in Calgary and on this initiative. And so any families that I've met, I have had the pleasure of meeting a fair number so far, but we have a long way to go because we want to have a broad collection from all across Canada. We have had success in Montreal, and I understand in Halifax, and of course the Toronto area, but we've got a long way to go. And basically it's not only for the 2023 exhibit, but it's for the future generations. So again, thank you very much, Karen. And I look forward to your next documentary.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Wonderful. Yes, thanks so much, Karen. Thank you. Karen and Griffin would be happy to share that info. And actually, Catherine Clement is her collection is actually part of Who's Chinatown, currently on exhibit at Griffin Art Projects. And she was actually part of a collectors panel that we hosted live over Zoom. So if anyone's interested, you can find that discussion on Griffin Art Projects website if you go to our event archive page. But yes, thank you so much. And next up, we have Karen Tam, who is the curator of Who's Chinatown, on the call. So Karen, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Hi.
Hi, Karen.
Oh, good. Hi, Karen and Jazz. Thanks so much for your talk, and it was just amazing to watch your film again. I hadn't seen it in a long time, and it was just as striking and poignant, moving, and so important, like you said, especially like with what's been happening this past year. So thank you for that. And also, I'm really excited about your next project. So my question, I'm curious about the archival footage that you incorporated into In the Shadow of Gold Mountain, both the family footage that, as you say, was really rare to find, like footage of that time of Chinese families. So I kind of wanted to, maybe if you could talk a little bit about that. And then the other, I guess, question was, where you were able to access the other archival footage, which I'm assuming was more like in public archives, and how much of it was available when you embarked on the film, like how much was there? And then I guess now for public access, because I think it's so important with, documentation, whether it's film or photographs, that it be made publicly available so that we can all see our stories out there, and that they're not just hidden in some storage. Thank you.
Yeah. No, Karen, that's a really great comment to make. Yeah, in my film, there's a portion in the film in the middle where there's actual 8mm film. It's not even Super 8 of my own family. It's my father and his siblings, in the early 1950s, growing up together. And that is the kind of footage that is extremely rare because there weren't children, because there weren't women, in barely any of the that, you know, there weren't any children to be born because in the Chinese community it was so bachelor heavy because of all the immigration policies. In the Shadow of Gold Mountain has an extensive portion of the footage in that film is from the National Film Board archives, because at the time also of the Second World War, the NFB was one of the only film archives in the world. And even when, you know, footage was seized from Germany or Japan, it all actually went to this kind of giant fridge that's at the side of Côte de Liesse Road in Montreal. So a lot of the footage was from the National Film Board's own archives. And I believe, I mean, the more modern day stuff, as I'd mentioned, actually is from Sid Tan's personal archive and you know, news clips from CBC and whatnot. But a large portion of it was the NFB or my own family's footage. And then other than that, it was kind of photos from the different subjects in the film that, you know, that we had scanned or we filmed. But it is really important. You know, because I'm working on this Chinatown film, I'm trying to dig into the archives, and I'm sure Karen to put together the exhibit, like the idea of trying to find photos of old Chinatown, you know. So I mean, there are a lot of this stuff. It's available, but it hasn't necessarily been digitized. And as a filmmaker, or a documentarian, it's this one of these existential questions where sometimes it's so hard to access or to afford to access the archives that it's hard to tell the stories. And one thing that really struck me, and I'm actually talking to a filmmaker out in Edmonton, Sean C, about this. I remember I worked on a genealogy series. It's kind of an aside, but it is related. And the National Archives at that moment, they were doing something with Inuit youth called Project Naming, because the National Archives had thousands and thousands and thousands of photographs of up north when kind of explorers and all of this went up north, and they took photos of the people up there, the Inuit people, but they didn't name them. So literally the photo, you'd see a photo and it would be called Eskimo 1, 2, 3, and 4. Nothing, no info about any of these people. And they sent young people who were in this in Ottawa. They scanned all these photos and sent them up north to their you know, to their villages with laptops, and to put names to these photos. And I remember we went with this one woman, and lo and behold, her great grandmother was in one of these photos. And it was for a show that I was a documentary we were doing on it. And in the end, we wanted to show obviously this photo, but the family of the photographer, so this is like the photographer had been long dead, but you know, copyright gets handed down. The charge for this, I mean, we paid it in the end, but it was like $1,000 to put this one photo on screen. And it was the girl we were filming, it was her grandmother, you know, and this photo, or her great grandmother, this photographer never asked her name, never asked her permission. But now you know, we're spending like $1,000 to put this photo in a film to tell the. But anyways, all this to say, this Project Naming named those photos. So now we know who those people are, where they come from, what is their stories. And a lot of those folks hadn't seen those photos of you know, their great grandparents since the person had died. They didn't have cameras up there, you know. So it's very powerful, you know, keeping these archives, but also making them publicly accessible. And I know at one point there was a kind of push for the NFB, because it does have one of the largest archives in the world, to really digitize that and put it on a Creative Commons license. And if anyone is familiar with Creative Commons stuff, it's kind of like free use, you know, for educational purposes. And it's like a quid pro quo thing. It's like you know, I'll put this archive up for use. If you make a film, then you'll make your film accessible for you. So the idea of being able to tell the history becomes accessible to everyone. So I mean, it's something I'm a very big proponent of, being able to kind of share the history. And if folks are looking for these kind of photographs and whatnot that were in my film, I do still have some of them on a hard drive. They are public domain. You know, you have to give credit to Library and Archives Canada, but I would you know, be happy to send you a scan, you know, for some of the things that I do have access to.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Karen. So we have Lisa Baldessera, who is Griffin Art Project's director, who will speak next. So Lisa, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
There, I think I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Well, lucky me that I get to thank both Karens at the same time. Just incredible just to hear both of you and to hear from you, Karen, about your film today and just the power of the activism and the archival research, which is a place where I think both you and Karen Tam, curator, overlap in terms of that just commitment to finding these connections that are in the exhibition. We just so wish that you could see the exhibition, and we'll make sure you see images of it, and so that you can see how much the film making that you've done, animates a lot of what Karen is working with in the exhibition, and all of the new stories, the details that you've shared today. I just really want to thank you for providing that information and the backstory of the kind of activism that's gone into your work. And thank you, Karen, again for facilitating all of this to happen. And I guess, I wonder, in terms of the film that you're working on now, just very curious, it's been such a year of duress for everyone, but certainly for you, and thinking about these histories again in your current project, I wonder if there are any things that have sort of opened up for you over this year in terms of the next stages of your research, other than the things you've already commented on, and how you see it kind of shaping and again, showing that resilience that keeps coming through in these projects.
Yeah, I mean, I think to talk to the present day film, I mean, it is kind of that resilience piece that struck me, because I have seen, the NFB did a really beautiful film. I think it was around 2012 on Vancouver's Chinatown. That it was a great film, but at the same time, there was a kind of melancholy to it. That, having been in the Chinatown and knowing so many of the folks there, I was also surprised by, in the sense that, I did want to talk more about the agency of the community itself. Like gentrification isn't just something that happens to us while we sit there and watch, and there are so many stories of folks, I've met up with so many of these people and hope to kind of be capturing some of the work that they're doing. But like, for instance, Friends of Chinatown in Toronto, T-Base in Toronto, the WOW project. These are all things I encourage people to Google, because they're amazing stories. But the Wing on Woe is the oldest porcelain store in New York's Chinatown. There's a 5th generation owner there who's basically opened up the storefront as a kind of community gathering place. And it's really a place where these kind of conversations about the future of the neighborhood are being hashed out, and new, even what's happening with Carol Lee out in Vancouver, like these kind of trying to find new models of revitalization that puts kind of the cultural production of the neighborhood at the forefront, and really kind of talking about these intangible cultural assets. Like, I'm not sure, people don't know about the family societies, the family associations, how important they were back then. They were basically the social safety net, the social service providers of the community. And in the terms of Chinatown, they're also the folks that are legacy landlords. Like, they own the buildings in Chinatown. So if these places sell to developers, or like we're one step closer to losing the Chinatown, but you have to understand the importance of those places and the history that and the people that are alive and still active within them. So I guess, it's a kind of long-winded story, because in a way I'm working through the film, and often when you're in the middle of it, you don't quite notice all these patterns or things, but I am trying to focus on, in a way, how Chinatown has survived so long, like the story of Chinatown. And I think the thing that, it's a history piece, but really brought me into the moment we're in is Chinatown itself, like how it started, how this, this architectural thing we know to be like pagodas and Chinese arches of Chinatown was invented in San Francisco after the earthquake, when they tried to wipe Chinatown off the map, and they tried to push it to the suburbs, and a very clever group of Chinese businessmen hired some white architects to make up a fake fantasy version of what white people would want a Chinatown to look like. And that's where this kind of style of pagodas and all this came from. It's actually a North American invention, and it was a survival mechanism that the community cleverly put together that saved Chinatown. And time again, Chinatown has reinvented itself, kind of risen from the literal ashes in some of these instances to remain. And I think that speaks to the resiliency of the community. And we're kind of in a moment like that now with COVID, you know, and all of the kind of devastation on the economic level, a tourist level of Chinatown. So seeing how the community will rewrite the blueprint for the neighborhood is very interesting to me. And I'm hoping to be able to, you know, follow that as it happens.
Oh, really exciting. I can't wait to see what happens. We'll all be watching at Griffin.
Amazing. I'm going to jump back on here, Karen, just to echo Lisa in offering a huge thank you on behalf of Griffin Art Projects for joining us here today and for facilitating this super rich and super powerful conversation. It ties right in with the Who's Chinatown exhibition in such a timely way, and so thankful to have you sharing your project and your work and your projects with us as well. So thank you so much. And thank you for everyone who joined us here today and for everyone who contributed to the conversation. It's been a pleasure hosting you, Karen, and having everyone contribute to the conversation. So thank you. And to everyone, have a great rest of your Sunday.
Thank you, everyone.